All right, so we're back from reading break, and here we go. This is week 6 of Linguistics 102. This week we're looking at first language acquisition. In this video, as usual, I will recap last week's stuff, preview the material we're covering this week, and remind you about some things, the important stuff in our schedule. Okay, so before reading week, we had a look at psycholinguistics. That was chapter 12 of the textbook. And that was really all that happened that week. There wasn't anything due or any quiz or anything. This week we're diving into first language acquisition. So that's chapter 10 of the textbook. This material will naturally connect with next week's topic on second language acquisition, but there are a remarkable number of things that are particular to just one or the other of these, and we'll learn some of the reasons why over the next couple of weeks. So just as in the past, the previous two topics, this one involves a fair bit of methodology. We find out how linguists investigate the relevant questions in addition to learning some of the results of that research. So right off the bat in the chapter, we revisit a distinction that we saw in psycholinguistics between experimental and non-experimental methods of data collection. In first language acquisition, the non-experimental methods are called naturalistic studies. They're often diary studies with data being collected by the parent and or the researcher. And in some prominent studies, the parent is the researcher. By their nature, these naturalistic studies are usually longitudinal. They gather data over the course of several months or even years, observing the same child. Experiments in language acquisition tend to be cross-sectional. They look at groups of children at different ages to simulate the time dimension. So they're not looking at one child going through those stages, but here's a bunch of 2-year-olds, here's a bunch of 3-year-olds, here's a bunch of 4-year-olds, and so on, and sort of look at the difference between those as a proxy for the developmental process. So after introducing some specific naturalistic and experimental study types, we move on to some findings. So phonologically, we learn about babbling, about the order that sounds are required in, about some of the common patterns in the sound production of children as they're moving towards acquisition of the adult grammar. This is kind of how and why kids' speech has the distinctive and often interesting patterns that it has. That's sort of some of the cute things that they do in terms of sounds. Next, we learn about some lexical development. That's acquiring individual words. Rates of word learning, as well as the types of words that are learned early, and some of the psychological mechanisms that seem to drive those preferences. We also learn some terms for describing mistakes, the ways that children interpret input and they assign meaning to words that isn't quite the meaning that the adults or the other speakers in the environment intend. So it's another way of linguistically categorizing some of the cute, fun stuff that kids do with their language. In the section on morphology, we see the famous WUG test. This is an iconic linguistic experiment. We learn about what types of morphological processes are preferred early versus later in acquisition. And then closing off the tour of basic findings, we look at some syntactic patterns. The chapter ends with a survey of some environmental and cognitive factors that drive and that enable language acquisition. This section does include a couple of somewhat disturbing case studies of individuals who had dramatically deprived social situations when they were young and the enduring effects of that deprivation on their cognitive and linguistic development. So much for the content. This week on Tuesday, that's the day after I post this video, we have the quiz for the sociolinguistics and psycholinguistics material. All right, that's available just that day. That's February 23rd, Tuesday. So make sure to complete it before midnight Alberta time, which is Mountain Daylight Time right now, I think. Maybe it's standard. I always forget. Anyway, complete it before midnight. And if you're not in the Alberta time zone, do a time zone, online time zone check to make sure the translation is right. Because it may close earlier or later depending on which side of our time zone you are. The practice quizzes for those modules are available if you want to check your grasp of the material beforehand. And I will aim to have that quiz marked before our tutorial on Thursday so that we can review it as well as discussing any questions that you have about first language acquisition. So that's it for this week's video. Go through chapter 10 of the textbook to learn the material, try out the practice quizzes, do the quiz on Tuesday, and come along to Thursday's tutorial if you can. And as always, let me know if you have any questions or requests or anything like that. Okay? Enjoy.